Well, welcome again to the Notre Dame Alumni Association Shared Read, presented by the affinity groups of the NDAA. And we're pleased to have our two remaining panelists. I say remaining because this is the final episode of the Shared Read. And we have the second Black Student Body president present. We're going to hear a lot from him in a moment, Corey Robinson, and all the wonderful things he is doing. Then we have Dr. Katie Washington Cole. Well, Katie, you need to know that you triggered this book, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. But before we do that, I am so pleased at all times to turn over the program to my dear friend of almost 53 years, who I met for the first time in Farley Hall. And Don, would you introduce yourself before we continue?
Sure. I'm Don Wycliff, currently a resident of South Bend, class of '69, retired journalist, and delighted to be participating in this. Co-editor with David of Black Donors.
Okay, thank you, Don. I'm glad we should put that little prop up. This is what we're talking about here. Black Donors, all right. Well, Katie, Dr. Katie, you have to know that way back when I graduated from Notre Dame in 1971, I just kind of sat back and I looked at the accomplishments of people like Bill Hurd in the eye surgery business. I also saw Ellen Page become the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. And I thought to myself, we need to start recording some of these things, these great accomplishments by Black alumni at the University of Notre Dame. And then as Don begins the connective tissue for your decade of 2010, he says at the beginning, if I can find it, yes, he says on May 16, 2010, something happened at Notre Dame. That's when Katie Washington Cole stepped up to the podium and became the first Black valedictorian at the University of Notre Dame. I said, we got to do this book. I called Don Wycliff, and here we are. We're concluding this shared read of Black Donors. So Katie, thank you for your accomplishments, and we'll talk about that in a moment. In fact, Katie, I'm going to read from part of the concluding paragraph of your essay. Bear with me, and I'd like to get your response to it. You write, I'm grateful that graduation day was one of many symbols that our world had progressed beyond Jim Crowism and many forms of discrimination. However, disenfranchisement and injustice have taken on new forms in our social, political, and economic systems. I am often reminded of the children in our country and around the world who are systematically denied opportunities to learn and prosper. In schools throughout the country, including Notre Dame, where many young people are still unprepared, isolated, and inadequate. What do you mean by that?
Oh, goodness, that was quite a quote. You sometimes I don't think that I knew what I was writing when I was writing it, or how much it would still mean to me today. You know, it resonates with me very deeply how both of you kind of talk about the importance of documenting the history of Black donors, donors of African descent, who have made important contributions not only to our university, but to the world. That was sort of a key point of my own essay, is about ancestry and legacy, where we've come from and where we hope to go. So for me, in that moment on May 16th, 2010, and even till today, I sort of wrestle with this tension between past, present, and future, because in the present moment, we can look back and see the accomplishments of our ancestors, those who came before us, and our elders who are still with us today. But we can also see that in this present moment, there is still immense injustice at multiple levels of our society, the way that that is individually felt by students on campus, all the way up to the way that our economic and political systems exclude certainly people of African and Black descent in this country, but others as well. So on one hand, our past is a wonderful mirror in terms of how far we've come and what has changed. But I also hope, now that I am a mother myself of a almost 3-year-old, that the world that she lives in looks very different from the one that I live in currently, and certainly that her grandparents and great grandparents and again, the elders who have come before us at Notre Dame lived in as well.
Katie, before we move on to Corey, tell us a little bit about where you're at and what you're doing. I called you doctor, so tell me why I called you that.
Yeah, so right after Notre Dame, I went out to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. I completed my medical degree and also a PhD at the School of Public Health in the social and behavioral determinants of public health. So the way that I like to think about it is that I am very interested in community-based health and understanding structures and systems that affect our health. And now I'm in psychiatry residency. So I am in the process of getting specialty training in psychiatry to sort of be able to deepen the work that I do around mental health in the community. So who knows exactly what that will look like in the long term, but completed a couple of doctorate degrees and now finishing up, well, not quite finishing up, kind of midway through my specialty training in psychiatry in Chicago, actually.
Okay, thank you. And we were very fortunate to have you because you had maneuvers, clients, etc. So
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, sure.
Now, Corey, we seem to hang out a lot lately with all these different projects. And I have to tell you, I was honored in 1970 to be elected the first Black student body president. And then 46 years later, you become and are elected the second Black student body president. However, in your presidency, you did something that no one had done in the history of student life at Notre Dame. You promoted and sponsored a race relations week. Would you start telling us about what your purpose was in doing that, how you think it went, and was it effective in any way? And then we'd like to hear a little bit more about what you're doing, because you're doing exciting things at this time. Corey.
Look, I'm definitely not saving the world like Katie. I'm just talking about sports for a living. So, dude, I don't know about exciting things, but yeah, Race Relations Week, basically, just let me paint the scene, a little bit. I was honored and privileged to be, to follow your footsteps, David. I mean, you laid the groundwork, and I never wanted to be student body president. It was just an opportunity for me to serve my community, and I always tell people who want to serve in any type of leadership role, I tell them, if you want, don't seek out that leadership position, right? Because I think you have to be called to that, and then you rise up to it, and then you serve dutifully and you try your best. The great news is that I had a wonderful team, so my job was easy. Rachel Wallace did an unbelievable job organizing all the moving pieces of Race Relations Week, along with many, many other people across campus. But the whole idea was coming off of that summer of police violence. We wanted to do something that was more than just a prayer service. And in my old age, the 3 years since I graduated, I don't want to downplay the necessity of prayer. I really have learned that prayer, you can move a mountain with prayer, and that even though Notre Dame always rushes to do a prayer service, it is not oh, they're just doing a prayer service. I realize that that's a really important aspect of healing, just generally. So I want to make sure I make that point. But we were kind of frustrated that it ended there. So the idea was what if we just have a series of conversations? And then you reached out to me, and we were able to work with Rachel and many other people on campus to say, what are the biggest challenges facing us right now? And then how can we as students invite people to comment on that? And kind of push the dialogue forward to create actual change and inspire others to take up this fight. And we did a play, because we were thinking it's not just a lecture. We want to think of other ways to reach out to people. So, among the two highlights for me that were really interesting is one was a play by a priest, a Holy Cross priest who was a one-act play in Legends. And I thought that was a great way to talk about race. And the other one, what that really stood out to me was when we went to DPAC and we had you along with the Munoz sisters and my dad. And there was one other person, Christina Brooks, who was the diversity officer for the city of South Bend. They all came to talk about their challenges of dealing with race and relations in their particular industries, right? What was so fascinating to me about that experience, though, David, just to wrap it up, is that event, I thought we got DPAC, right? So I was like, oh snap, like we're gonna knock it out of the park. There's gonna be like 1,000 people there. We're gonna change the world. Like we made this thing happen. Show up to the night, it was raining, and like 100 students showed up. And it was so heartbreaking to me because I saw all the hard work everyone put in, and I was like, only 100 people came. But what I realized, that always sat with me, and I was like, dang, we put all this work in and it didn't do anything. And then I looked on Notre Dame's website, and last year they're still doing Race Relations Week. It's like an inaugural thing now, I guess. So every year they just keep adding on and doing stuff. So that really made me excited because, you know, that the first step is never going to be easy, and you're going to be embarrassed, and you're going to really, you know, put yourself out there and get the short end of the stick. But the people ahead of you will enrich the legacy, and that's all we can hope for.
Thank you, Corey. Don, what are you thinking? What would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask Katie. You came from a predominantly Black city. You went to public schools, as I recall.
Yep.
And you showed up at this campus 90 miles away, roughly, that was all white, or virtually so. How did you feel? What did you think? Did it throw you for a loop or what?
Yes, I was thrown for a loop. I felt like a fish out of water. I think that, you know, the thing about Notre Dame that really attracted me was actually meeting a bunch of the Black alumni during my visitation weekend, and seeing the community that existed on the campus. And so that was something that stayed with me, even in feeling like a fish out of water. But it was a huge culture shock. And I say that as a person who did exceedingly well there, to say, you know, just because you get good grades and, you know, are able to do all kinds of outstanding things in your time at Notre Dame, which many of our graduates have done, but it can still, again, it's these tensions. It's like, yes, like Notre Dame was a great place for me to flourish and to learn. And I met mentors who were invested in who I was as a person, and that helped me to be who I am today. So that's on one hand, while at the same time kind of wrestling with the day-to-day of going from Gary, Indiana, which, you know, at the time that I grew up and still today has, you know, probably a African-American population of above 95, maybe even above 98%.
Yeah.
You know, and my high school was the site of one of the really important Black Power conferences where, you know, folks like Jesse Jackson and representatives from the Black Panthers came to talk about Black Power. So he went from that to Notre Dame, and it was quite strange and quite challenging at times. I was reading through some of, you know, folks have been gathering stories of their experiences at Notre Dame, and many of them, whether it be being asked if you're an athlete, not that there's anything wrong with being an athlete, being questioned about your movements on campus in a way that white peers might not be asked about their movements. Things that come up in diversity education. I was a diversity educator from sophomore through senior year. I think that's now a different role within the curriculum, but the types of challenging questions you sometimes hear where, you know, you see your peers and colleagues lacking in some level of humility and compassion around some of the racialized experiences on campus.
Mm-hmm.
So even in excelling and finding support for my needs on campus, you know, there was this tension to have to sit with as a Black student.
I'd like to follow up. You said finding support for your needs on campus.
Yeah.
Who did you find? Who found you?
I got found a lot, which was the fortunate part for me. And I don't know how that happens if that happens for everyone who comes from a place that is different from Notre Dame. But, you know, people like in particular, the faculty in the College of Science would see how I was doing in their classes, reach out to me. I wouldn't have even really considered a path in research at all had it not been for, you know, I think about specific people, Dr. Hellquist, who taught my organic chemistry class, was like, you're doing exceedingly well and you should consider this and you should consider that. Ultimately my research advisor, who ended up being my research advisor, you know, from sophomore to senior year, was a genetics professor who saw my potential, Dr. Severson, who's now retiring. And, you know, his mentorship was key and influential. And he saw my promise for whatever reason. And I don't know exactly what made these specific individuals and many, many others on the campus to see me very early on in my trajectory and help carry me along the way. I think a lot of that is in the spirit of Notre Dame. It's just a question of, do we make sure that each student who arrives to campus has somebody who is reaching out to them, caring for them in the way that I was cared for on campus.
Yeah. Very good, very good. Corey, I'd like to ask you, among your other distinctions was that you were, if I'm not mistaken, the first football player ever to be elected student body president. Is that right?
I guess so.
I always thought that sounded so busy.
It's funny because, yeah, like just like you, Katie, you had people who found you. That really resonated with me because so many people reached out to me. I remember Alex Kocha, and I mentioned these people in my essay, but Alex Kocha was a student body president and a fencer. And the fencing team at Notre Dame is one of the best in the country. So, I mean, they won national championship after national championship. And during my time, I was thinking about applying for the Rhodes. I applied 3 times. The closest I got was within spitting distance. You know, I was a finalist, but I never got it. But the amount of people that mentored me, including one of my idols growing up, Myron Rolle. I mean, Florida State DB, who then becomes a Rhodes Scholar and goes to the NFL.
Yeah.
You know, and then now he's a neurosurgeon resident at Harvard. Like, so like stuff like that, like somehow, some way I found myself meeting these people and they reached out to me and said, if you have any questions, just let me know. And that was incredibly inspiring to me. And I think the only thing you do when you're in that position is pay it forward. Mm-hmm. So now, like, I remember when I was a senior on campus and I felt like I wasn't that busy really, because I don't know why, I just felt like I was just talking with people and people were inspiring me and I was trying to inspire other people. And it was this beautiful life-giving relationship where somehow, some way, I was just juiced up every day to go to work, if you will. Mm-hmm. So I think that was the biggest thing of how I became, I guess, the first, but I hope I'm not the last.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you make sure that happens for, as Katie said, for every student, particularly Black students at Notre Dame, who tend to come and feel somewhat isolated if the student petition is an indication?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really tough because from my perspective, like Katie said earlier, I think we may have mentioned this earlier in the call where like athletes are sometimes seen as different, or like, you know, everyone kind of has like these weird kind of paths, or I might be misquoting, but let me just say it up front. Athletes are separate from the student body, particularly football guys. So I never felt that kind of pressure. I always kind of felt accepted because you would have random kids come up to you and take a photo with you. You know, like that doesn't necessarily happen to other students on campus.
Yeah.
But so my experience was very different. So when I actually sat down and listened to students tell me about their experience of being Black at Notre Dame, I had one friend who had to transfer, right? And it was crazy because we both grew up in the same type of environment and we both had the same type of support system, but we had 2 different trajectories. Mm. And that was because, like I said before, people went out of their way to help me and show me the way forward and say, you can be a Rhodes Scholar. I didn't even know I could apply. I didn't even know what it was. And someone told me, no, like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about applying for this scholarship? Have you thought about running for a student body president? Or have you thought about being a part of SAC? Have you thought about sitting down with this priest who, yeah, you're not interested in that class, but they're very interesting. Maybe you should just sit down and build a relationship. Mm-hmm. So all those people that inspired me to get out of my comfort zone was the biggest, I think, impetus for me personally. And I think when I was on campus, I just noticed that a lot of Black students tended to hang out, like, you know, like we would almost like self-segregate ourselves. And even the Black football guys, like even football guys, we segregated ourselves within the football team. You know, I only hang out with 5 or 6 guys or whatever. And I always didn't understand that concept of self-segregation, even in like student government. Certain people in student government only hung out with certain student government people. Mm-hmm. And for me, I always wanted to be the most uncomfortable. I always wanted to be in the most uncomfortable position. So I wanted to say, look, I don't know anything about campus life. I'm going to go into student government, go into the heart of it and learn. And I'm going to be the guy who's the dumbest in the room and just ask questions. And because of that, I think I was able to grow, but it was really embarrassing. I found myself stumbling a lot, but I like making mistakes. So it worked out for me. So that was my biggest thing for Black students at Notre Dame currently is try to go out of your way to be the most uncomfortable you can, and someone will meet you there. At least that was my experience.
You know, it's interesting. You talk about comfort zone, and Katie in her valedictory address used that term as well, talked about getting out of our comfort zones.
Yeah.
It seems sometimes we are reluctant to do that. Mm-hmm. It's a tough thing to do.
It is tough. I mean, I think for me, I think about, you know, making the jump to be present on a campus like Notre Dame is already such a big jump for Black students in particular, because that's sort of the experience that the specific experience we're talking about here. But for many, I'm sure, of specific life experience prior to Notre Dame, it can be a very uncomfortable place to be, uncomfortable position to be in. And the question that I end up asking myself is, are we asking Black students or Black alumni, Black people in society to be uncomfortable more often than we're asking other groups to be? Are we, because I think the thing about structural racism is that structural racism is designed to tell people in this country that there is something that is inadequate in Black people. Mm-hmm. And the way that that gets internalized by our systems and also internalized on an individual basis is something that has to be confronted too. And so I don't think it's necessarily enough to say, you know, Black students, you have to put yourself out there because just by showing up, you've already put yourself out there potentially in a way that your, you know, almost 2,000 other classmates have not necessarily done that day. But on top of that, then who else is being asked to be uncomfortable? Who else is being asked to confront the systems and structures that have told Black people that they are either inadequate or inferior? Have we confronted those within our classrooms? Have we confronted those within the structures of our institutions, including our university? So I don't think it can just be the Black students who feel uncomfortable. I think we all need to get uncomfortable to try to confront some of the things that are the legacy of slavery and Jim Crowism and mass incarceration and housing segregation and education segregation in our country. So I'm down for feeling uncomfortable. I just want somebody else to feel uncomfortable with me.
No, yeah, and I think we see that right now, Katie, with allyship. You know, like people saying, "Look, I don't understand, but I'm standing with you," and that is, you know, uncomfortable for a lot of people to have these conversations.
Yeah,
and I completely agree. And it's funny because what you said really also just made me think. When I was a kid, you know, like I always think about like my ancestors as well, and that's why I really appreciate about Katie's essay. But my grandpa, you know, grew up in Arkansas, and when I talked to him about his experience growing up, the one thing that I think was the greatest gift he gave to my dad was the belief that you could do anything. Like my dad grew up thinking that he could go to the Naval Academy, thinking he could be an engineer. He could, like, and I didn't understand what that meant until, you know, I grew up thinking the same thing. Like I grew up thinking I can go to Harvard, I can go to Stanford, I can go play football at Notre Dame. I don't care that I play, you know, at a small high school in Texas. Like I can make it work. And that was the greatest gift my parents ever gave me, but I didn't understand that not everyone had the same opportunity to think like that. And that's where I was doing a lot of education myself and just realizing, oh my goodness, like there is all these things that Katie's bringing up that we need to address and kind of dismantle and just talk about and say, this is why I think the way that I do. Because I'm so grateful to my parents for believing in me and telling me, if you have a dream, don't let anyone stop you. I don't care how long it takes. It could take you 50 years, but just keep pushing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corey. And Don, as we conclude, I think we're within minutes. We have two Black alumni who are closest in age to the current student body. In conclusion, I'm wondering if you have some words of wisdom or advice for the current student body and maybe for future generations of Black students at Notre Dame. And before I do that, Corey, I have to tell the audience that you have been hired by NBC as a sports announcer. What's your official title?
Yeah, sports reporter.
Or as a sports reporter. So we're going to see you at ND games sooner than later, I hope. All right.
Hopefully.
Katie, just a couple sentences about your family background. I did a little research on your great uncle, C.D. Hubert. Could you tell us in a few sentences about him before you address that last question I put out there?
A perfect transition, because that's exactly sort of where I will hope to go in terms of giving advice for current students and into the future. So C.D. Hubert Reverend C.D. Hubert was my great-grandmother's brother. And he was a professor, first of all, of theology at Morehouse University, one of the historically Black colleges and university in Atlanta, Georgia, and was acting president there for a while. When I learned that Martin Luther King Sr. wrote a note to be read at his funeral service, I recognized that, this particular branch of my family tree is kind of important. Okay, I need to know more about this. But he was certainly a leader spiritually and religiously in his time, but he spoke very openly about discrimination, and in his era it was more blatant Jim Crow. It was more of systematically and intentionally very out in the open, keeping people, Black people of African descent, out of system structures, institutions. And we know the legacy of that still exists today, but obviously it's in a different breed. He and my great-grandmother were in the first generation of people in that particular family line to be born not enslaved. So their achievements and accomplishments, all of them went to college. They had their own family plantation and church. They were ministers and teachers and raised their families. So to accomplish all of that, one generation, when your parents have been enslaved, is quite remarkable. And I think that we don't necessarily always get the benefit of knowing that history and documentation, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the thing my dad would always say when he was researching this history is we didn't just start as slaves. We didn't start enslaved. That's not the beginning of who we are. We were, when I look back even further, I had healers, people who practiced traditional medicine, women who were midwives before they were brought here forcibly to this country. And so, the thing that I would say to students as you're thinking about your space of who you are at Notre Dame, but also beyond Notre Dame, is that for Black people, our history, our legacy, our traditions, the thing that make us a people, even though we are really diverse and not at all a monolith, is that knowing a little piece of your history can give you insight into sort of who you are in this present moment and where you hope to go. And that our history informs us that we are not inadequate. We are not less than, we are not inferior. And in fact, many of the things that were systems and structures that were put in place to tell us that we were inferior, tried to or have actually hidden some of our history from us. So getting more intimately familiar with one's own history, or even just something as simple as Black domers, and by simple, I mean, it is already here and already easily accessible. Not that it was a simple undertaking, because I know that it wasn't. But we have access to resources to remind us of where we came from and to gain a deep foundation in who we are and where we hope to go. Our history is so rich, and none of us is an island needing to do this on our own. We have lots of elders, just like the two of you, who have really paved the way, and we continue to do so for future generations of Black domers and our families who end up not being domers too.
Corey, you've spoken a little bit about this already, but do you have any concluding thoughts on that? How would you speak to the current students right now at Notre Dame?
Just to build off of that, I would say listen. Listen to, obviously, your elders, listen to the history, but listen to people you don't agree with. Those have always been the greatest growth moments for me. And this goes back to putting myself, I guess, in uncomfortable positions, but just listening to everything and then making your own kind of decisions on that, but listening first and foremost. And then I would say, like, I never understood endurance. I never understood what that meant. But I think about, like, Nelson Mandela's quote that, you know, at the top of every mountain is just another mountain. Like, this is not something that's just going to be solved like in 20 years or in a tweet or, you know, in just one moment. This is something that you live your whole life for. You commit. It's a lot. Like, there's this one like idea that floats around where, you know, what does it mean to live for something versus to die for something? But to live for something, I mean, I think about like a marriage. Like, you show up every day and you commit yourself to them every day for 50, 60, 70 years. Like, that is love. Love isn't like, you know, a dining hall date and you're like, oh, she's so cute, or oh, he's so cute. Like, that's not what love is, right? Love is that commitment. And that's why I think of, like, with this change, like, when you really want to devote yourself to being an activist or being, you know, a change maker or being someone who, you know, it wants to make a difference, it's going to be a battle for life. And you got to be willing to show up every day. And some days it's not going to go well. Some days you're not going to feel like getting out of bed. Some days you're going to be like, oh man, like, I'm not doing anything. It's been 30 years and I feel like I'm pounding my head against the wall. I'm moving backwards, but you still got to move forward. So just be patient in the sense of work every day, work hard, but understand that this is a lifelong journey. And then have fun with it. Yeah. Surround yourself with people you love, like you and Don doing great things with people and telling stories. Make the labor a labor of joy, and pay it forward for the next generation.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Katie. Don, concluding remarks, sir?
All I can say is thank God for the two of you and the wisdom that you've just offered. It's terrific.
It is.
Thank you so much.
Well,
go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say all gratitude to both of you, David and Don, for paving the way, making sure that folks like us could have the opportunities that we have. I can't say thank you enough, but to live it out.
Thank you. And thank you, Fraser L. Thompson.
Yes.
As well, right?
Indeed. Indeed.
Well, we have a few thanks here. This is the concluding episode. So Don and I we join in thanking the Notre Dame Alumni Association affinity groups in putting on this shared read. And I hope that their purpose has been met by doing it. And Corey, I'm looking at you because people don't know that you are the coordinator of all these interviews. And this is the first time you have actually been on camera. So Don and I thank you as well. And with hope, there will be change. That might be 20 years, Corey, but let's hope for some change sooner than that, if at all possible.
Yeah, the third student body president is not going to take 46 years, David.
There we go. Let's hope not. Or the next valedictorian, right? Oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah,
Anyway.
yeah. Brian Williams said that in his speech at my graduation. Let us not keep celebrating firsts.
There we go. Well, again, thank you, everybody, and be well and safe.
Take care.